Hello and welcome to Chapter 7, Configuring Oracle Network Environment. In this chapter, we are going to use Oracle Net Manager to create new listeners, create Oracle Net Services aliases, and use Listener Control Utility to manage Oracle Net listeners, use tnsnames to test Oracle Net connectivity. Before discussing how to create a listener and how to manage a listener, let's take an overview about Oracle Net Services. Oracle Net Services enables network connections from the client or middle tier applications to the database servers. Oracle Net Services is responsible for establishing and maintaining the connection between the client application or the middle tier application and the database server, as well as exchanging messages between them. The Oracle Net Services exist on both client and database servers. Oracle Net, or something that simulates Oracle Net, like for example Java database connectivity, is located on each computer that needs to talk to the database server. On the client machine, Oracle Net is a background component for application connection to the database, while in the database server, Oracle Net includes an active process called listener, which is responsible for listening for incoming connections from the client or middle tier application. If your client or middle tier application connects to the database using Oracle Net Services, not using, for example, Java database connectivity, both Oracle Net configuration file exist at the client machine and at the database server machine. Oracle Net Listener. Oracle Net Listener is the gateway to your database for all non-local user connections. A single listener can service multiple database instances and thousands of client connections. There are two files for the listener exist under Oracle Home Network Admin. The first file, which is listener.ora, where you can define the listener information like host where the listener is running, port on which the listener is running, protocol of the listener. SQLnet.ora file, you can define some attribute and some advanced configuration for the listener like encryption and logging tracing features. SQLnet.ora file is the profile configuration, so it's sometimes called profile configuration. In order to establish a connection from the client or from middle tier to the database server, the client must know the server name or server IP where the listener is listening, port that the listener is listening at, protocol the listener is using, and name of the service or the database name that the listener is handling. So if you have all this information, you can connect from the client or from middle tier to the database by using either an application that use Oracle Net Services or from application something that simulate the Oracle Net Services like Java connectivity. In order to connect to the database, the client or the middle tier initiate a connection request to the database server by sending a connect string. In our example, this is the connect string. For example, I'm using SQL plus username system /password @orcl. So this is the connection string. ORCL here called connect identifier. A connect identifier can be the connect descriptor itself or name that resolve to a connect descriptor. In our case, ORCL here is a name that resolve to a connect descriptor. When a net service name is used, like in our example, connection processing takes place by mapping the net service name to the connection descriptor. This is the connection descriptor, which is providing the host where the listener exists, port of the listener, protocol of the listener, and the service name of the database. Service name of the database is by default equal to the global name of the database. Global name of the database, which is database name dot domain name. In case you don't have a domain, the service name is equal to the database name. You can create many service names for a single database by using dbms_services in case of a single node database, or by using a cluster utilities to create services in case you have a rack environment. After Oracle Net Names resolution is complete, a connection request is passed from the user or middle tier application to the listener. The listener receives a connect packet and checks whether the connect packet is requesting a valid database service name. If the listener receives a valid service name, the listener will create a server process that will be responsible for dealing with user process request to the database server. If the listener receives an invalid service name, the listener will respond by an error code to the user process. Oracle Net supports several methods of resolving connection information. The first method, which is using easy connect naming. In easy connect naming, there is no need for name resolution because you are providing the full connection string in line, the IP, the port, and the service name in line without providing a name service or service name. Local naming, use a local configuration file. You are connecting to the database by using a service name or name of the service, and this name service will be resolved locally by using a local configuration file at the client or middle tier server. Other naming methods like directory naming and external naming. In directory naming, to access a database service, the directory naming method store connect identifiers in a centralized directory server, not locally like local naming, in a centralized directory server that is compliant with LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. In external naming, the external naming method stores net service names in a supported non-Oracle naming service. Supported third-party services like, for example, Network Information Service, NIS, External Naming Distributed Computing Environment, DCE, Cell Directory Service, CDS. How to establish a connection from the client or middle tier application to the database server using Easy Connect. In Easy Connect, you are providing the full connection string in line without need to provide a name of the service, and this name of the service will be resolved either locally or in directory or in external naming method. You are providing the full connection string in line, like for example SQL plus name of the user, password of the user at, this is the name of the server that the database exists, where the database exists, or the IP address. For example, you can provide the name of the server or the IP address, colon, port where the listener is listening, slash service name or database service name. This is Easy Connect. There is no need for a configuration file at the client machine. You are providing a full connection string. The disadvantages of using Easy Connect: this method support only TCP/IP protocol, cannot support SSL protocol, does not support advanced connection options like connect time failover, load balancing, and source routing. We will discuss about these advanced connection options later on in this chapter. The second method, which is local naming. In local naming, the user supplies an alias for the Oracle Net service. In the Easy Connect, the user supplies the full connection string, which is the IP, protocol, and the database service name. In local naming, Oracle just provide the alias or name of the Oracle Net service, which must be resolved to IP of the server, port of the listener, protocol of the listener, and the database service name using a client configuration file exists at the client side, which is called tnsnames.ora file. Again, tnsnames.ora file This file is used to resolve ORCL alias to a IP address of the database server, port of the listener, protocol of the listener, and the database service name. Advantages of using local naming over using Easy Connect: support all Oracle Net Protocol, TCP/IP, and SSL. Support all advanced connection options like connect time failover, source routing, and load balancing. Other methods to connect to the database like directory naming and external naming. In directory naming, it requires an LDAP with Oracle Net names resolution information like Oracle Internet Directory and Microsoft Active Directory services. Also, in directory naming, it supports all Oracle Net protocols and support all advanced connection options like connect time failover, source routing, and load balancing. So in directory naming, the name resolution will be happened at the directory or at the LDAP directory server, not at the client machine. Last method to connect to the database using external naming method. In external naming method, the net service names is stored in a supported non-Oracle naming services like Network Information Service (NIS) or DCE like Distributed Computing Environment Cell Directory Services (CDS). In the previous slides, we take overview about Oracle Net Services, Oracle Listener, and the naming method to connect to the database, either Easy Connect, local naming, directory naming, or external naming. In this slide, we will see what the tools that are available for configuring and managing Oracle Net services. There are many tools to configure Oracle Net services. The first tool, which is called netmgr or Oracle Net Manager. The second tool called Network Configuration Assistant or Oracle Net Configuration Assistant, netca. The second tool, which is lsnrctl or Listener Control Utility. The last tool, Enterprise Manager. In Enterprise Manager, either Oracle 11g Enterprise Manager or Oracle Cloud Control, you can access Net Services Administration page to configure listener and naming resolution. In this chapter, we will use Oracle Net Manager to configure listeners and service names. To launch Oracle Net Manager, just type netmgr in Linux and Unix terminals. In Windows, you can find Oracle Net Manager in Start menu. As we can see, this is Oracle Net Manager. Here we can go to Profile. In Profile, you can enable tracing, logging, encryption of the listener. This profile write to SQL net.ora file, SQL net.ora file. So any configuration change in profile goes to SQL net.ora file. Service names, by adding new service names, this configuration files goes to tnsnames.ora file, tnsnames.ora file. The last one, which is listeners. In listener, if you change anything here in the listener section, it will goes to listener.ora file, listener.ora file. All these configuration files exist under Oracle Home/network/admin. Again, Oracle Home/network/admin. This directory path called tns_admin. You can also use the second tool, which is Oracle Net Configuration Assistant, to configure listeners, naming methods configuration, local namings, and directory usage configuration, the same way as using Oracle Net Manager. If you don't like Net Manager or Oracle Net Configuration Assistant, you can also configure listeners and TNS names by using Oracle Enterprise Manager or Cloud Control Net Service Administration page. Other tools to manage the listener, which is called Listener Control Utility. In Listener Control Utility, you cannot add a new listener, or you cannot configure a new listener, or changes encryption, or other advanced configuration for the listener. In listener control utility, you can manage start, stop, status, reload, for example, check the version of the listener, the services that the listener is listening on. This is the listener control utility. It is only used for control the listener. It's not used for configure the service names or configure a new listeners. So to launch the listener control utility, you can use lsnr, stand for listener, ctl stands for control, listener control utility. You can run the command either inline by using, for example, lsnrctl start name of the listener, or start, stop, status, and so on, or you can just click enter and goes to the prompt of the listener control utility, click help. All this is the commands of listener control utility. You can start listener, stop listener, check the status of listener, check the services of listener, enable tracing, save configuration, reload the configuration of listener, check the version, and so on. Advanced connection options. Oracle Net support the following advanced connection options with local and directory names. It's not supported for Easy Connect. It can be used with local and directory naming. Connect time failover, load balancing, and source routing. With connect time failover, the alias or the alias of the net service has two or more listener addresses listed. If the first address is not available, the second is tried. Oracle Net keeps trying addresses in the list order until it reaches a listener that is functioning, or until all addresses have been tried and failed. So this is mainly used in case of a rack environment, or in case you have two listeners or two listener ports on the same server. With load balancing, Oracle Net picks an address at random from the list of addresses. So, and also in load balancing, you have to have at least two addresses in the connection descriptor. The last advanced connection option, which is source routing. In source routing is used with Oracle Connection Manager, which serves as a proxy server for Oracle Net traffic. In source routing, Oracle Net treats the addresses as a list of relays, connecting to the first address and then requesting to be passed from the first to the second until you reach your destination. Last thing in this chapter is how to test Oracle Net connectivity using TNS ping. TNS ping, same as ping. If you ping, for example, www.oracle.com, you are requesting a DNS server to resolve the name to an IP address of the server. TNS ping do the same thing. It resolves the alias of the net service to a connection descriptor. For example, TNS ping ORCL. TNS ping ORCL, this is an alias, TNS name alias. This ORCL must be exist either locally at your local configuration tnsnames.ora, or at the directory, or at external if you are using external naming method. So in our case, because ORCL exists locally in our TNS name configuration file, it resolved to a connection descriptor. This is the connection descriptor. Description, address, protocol, the host of the server, database server, protocol where the listener is listening, and the service name. If it returns OK, that means the name resolution is fine. So TNS ping is used mainly to ensure connectivity between the client and the listener. It does not verify the service. It does not verify the service. TNS ping support either easy, local, and directory naming. So in this chapter, we discussed about Oracle Net services. We discussed about Oracle listeners, how to configure additional listeners by using either Net Manager, netca, or Oracle Enterprise Manager, Net Services Administration page, and how to use listener control utility, and how to use TNS ping to test Oracle Net connectivity between the client and the database server. In the practice, we will see how to configure local names resolution, how to configure an additional listener, and how to work with advanced connection options. I hope this video was informative for you, and thank you for watching.